Well, thank you for tuning in. We've got an absolutely mind-blowing interview this evening with author Tim Cohen. I've watched his work. He uses a lot of images, folks, and the symbolism, the images, the way the dots are connected. Your jaws are going to be on the floor by the end of this. I guarantee they certainly were with me when I watched his other stuff. But huge thank you for coming on, my friend. Tim's link, his website is in the description box. The book's out there as well. Please support his important work. And what got you into this in the first place, Tim? Because you was in the military, wasn't you?
I was. First, thanks for having me on, Shaun. Really been looking forward to this, so I appreciate it. In 1987, I was a cadet at the United States Air Force Academy, and I had been a Christian for less than a year at that point. I became a Christian in November of 1986. And from that point of becoming a Christian, I'd started to read voraciously through Scripture and eventually made my way to Revelation 13, read the book of Revelation, I don't know, 2 or 3 times. And then finally I just asked the Lord one afternoon, I said, what is this talking about in Revelation 13? So Revelation 13 has 2 beasts in the chapter and then a name calculation at the end of the chapter. And I was reading about that strange imagery, particularly of that first beast, which is described as a beast with feet like a bear, body like a leopard, mouth like the mouth of a lion. It says that this dragon gives this beast his power, throne, and great authority. In the prior chapter, Revelation 12, it tells us that's a fiery red dragon, and it's also identified explicitly as the devil, as Satan himself, and as the serpent who deceived Eve in the Garden of Eden, Revelation 12. So this dragon, the devil, is giving this beast his power, throne, and great authority, and I'm saying to the Lord, okay, what is this? There's no such thing in nature, right? Is this going to be some sci-fi-like chimeric hybrid that comes along at some point, or, what is this, right? Because I was convinced at that point that Scripture was literal, that it was literally true, and it was meant to be taken literally. But here's something that you can't really take literally, I thought. And so I'm saying, okay, God, would you please show me who and what is being spoken of here? And of course, at that point in my life, one of my least favorite subjects of all was history. I had next to zero knowledge of the British monarchy, just the minimal stuff I had to learn in high school to get through history and so forth. And no real interest in the topic. But then as I asked the Lord that, within days to a month, I had the core evidence identifying that beast with the literal imagery in my possession. And as it turned out, there was only one book in the world at that point that had the actual imagery, the official imagery published, and that was Boutell's Heraldry. And it happened to be that the cadet library at the Air Force Academy had that one book on heraldry in just a couple of dozen books on heraldry on its shelf, out of hundreds and hundreds of books on heraldry. So I found the imagery. I had the name calculation that another pastor had, who was in Colorado Springs. I was a Messianic Jew, a young Hebrew Christian at that point, Israelite Christian, an actual Cohen by birth. And this pastor one day on a Shabbat, I had lunch at his home, and he was an engineer working for Martin Marietta, and he just pulled out this thing that he and some other engineers had put together, and he said, hey, take a look at this. And it was the result of a computer program that they wrote to calculate the values of the names of prominent world figures. Martin Marietta engineer, and one of the names that they threw into the system was Charles, Prince of Wales. Well, the system that they used happened to be the correct system. And I'll go into that when we talk about the name calculation. Almost every system that people have used to try to show so-and-so is 666 has not been the correct system. Well, this one was. And the system is actually identified in the Greek text of Revelation 13. Most people don't know that. So the title Charles, Prince of Wales spat out in English on that system as 666. And it's a sequential system, not phonetic. So kind of like ASCII, if anybody's familiar with computer programming and the ASCII symbolic code, for early programming, it's along those lines where you've got a number assigned to each letter or character in a sequence. So it's sequential. And so that inspired me to go back to the academy and look in the cadet library to see what more I could find. And I came up with the official heraldic achievement in this case of Charles as Prince of Wales. And turns out it has on it the beast with feet like a bear, body like a leopard, mouth like a lion. It also has the red dragon of Wales on it, which, as it turns out, is the actual red dragon spoken of in Revelation 12 and 13. That dragon historically goes back thousands of years, and you can trace it all the way to the standards of the Roman cohorts that occupied ancient Judea. So John would have seen his version of it in his day, the one that ultimately led to the Dragon of Wales, historically. The Apostle John.
We've got 666 people watching across all platforms presently.
Wonderful. Okay.
What is the first image you'd like us to put on the screen, Tim?
Let's look at the cover of the first edition of the Antichrist and a Cup of Tea, published in 1998. Now, folks, I began writing the book in 1987. The second edition, which we'll see afterwards, was published in 2024, massively updated. So, yeah, if you can pull the first edition up on the screen. I don't know if I'll see it when you're sharing it, but you can let me know when people are able to see it.
Yeah, there's his screen. He's going to put that next image up.
Yeah, it's under First Beast, the First Beast folder.
Okay, if you want to work on that one, Ben. In the meantime, viewers, we've got almost 1,000 watching live right now. Here we go.
All right, so what you're looking at to us, looks like the left-hand side. In Heraldry, it's the right-hand side, because the beast is looking at you in Heraldry. So the beast that looks like a lion, leopard, bear beast on that left-hand side normally would be a lion or lion leopard representing England. And if one were to go and look at Queen Elizabeth II's official heraldic achievement, you'd see a normal lion right there. If you were to look at William's or Harry's, you'd see a lion or a lion leopard. What you wouldn't see is the exaggerated feet, that have bear-like claws. And so I'll point you to one other folder where we can see those claws a bit more clearly. Hopefully I sent that. I hope I didn't forget it. Give me just one moment. I'm going to see if I even gave you that.
Yeah, you're fine. Take your time. And viewers, Tim's website link is in the description box if you want to check out his work.
Okay. Yeah, it's under the folder dealing with the 1969 investiture. So if you'll go for a moment to the 1969 investiture folder, in that I show one of two versions of the graven heraldic achievements that was hung over the Queen's Gate. If you want to show that one, Ben. Hanging over the Queen's Gate. There's a subfolder with that. But at any rate, there were two versions hung over the Eagle's Gate and the Queen's Gate at Caernarvon Castle at the July 1969 investiture for Charles, where that heraldic achievement that's on the cover of the Antichrist and a Cup of Tea book was first shown to the world. And the graven versions, they have an appearance of cast iron, though they were actually made of plaster and painted to look like cast iron. And they're very large, and the devices are separated, the devices on the overall heraldic achievement. So Ben, if you go to the folder that says Graven Arms, you'll find in that some images that show one of the versions of the heraldic achievement as if it were graven, as if it were cast iron. But the reason I show that is the claws on that beast that has feet like a bear, body like a leopard, mouth like a lion on the cover of the book. The two graven versions, it's very obviously bear's claws that they actually used for the feet of that beast. So this is the one at the Queen's Gate, and it actually has bear's claws. And if you go to the folder that, the folder that's next to that, that says graven bear's claws, Ben. Now leave that image and go to the folder that says graven bear's claws. And that one I show an enlargement. Yeah, those are the claws of a bear, so people can see what they look like. Now go to the image that is grayscale, black and white, but grayscale, of bear's claws on Charles Eaglegate graven achievement. So I show the claws blown up, enlarged from the version that was hung over the Eagle's Gate. So people can see that they actually used bear's claws on those graven versions. If you're able to pull that image up, it is just the folder above where you are. And it says Bear's Claws on Charles Eaglegate Graven Heraldic Achievement. Now go up one folder higher than that.
It's like a lot of this stuff is in plain sight, but we don't know how to interpret it.
Yeah, and so that's what I'm doing. You'll notice, though, around the Queen and Charles in this image that's being displayed, you have the red dragon shown on either side, and in the center you have what's known as the Badge of the Black Prince. And that is the image that is on the ring, the signet ring that Charles has worn for decades, that gold ring, that he even wore when he was crowned king in 2023 on his finger. That Badge of the Black Prince goes back to the 14th century, and it ties in with the Order of the Garter and other things that we may get to. But at any rate, you can see the red dragon there with the unicorn, the lion, leopard, bear, beast, and then, of course, Charles and the Queen appeared in the center of that at the Queen's Gate. Ben, if you can go up one folder above where you are and show that bear's claw image, I want people to see that, if you're able to locate it. But at any rate, Charles and his mother appeared here right after he was crowned in July 1969. So you're in the bear's claw folder, Ben. That's not what we want. We want the folder above that. But that does let people see very clearly what bear's claws look like.
So I'm putting Tim's website link in the live chat.
That folder. So next to that image, Ben, is one that's grayscale with a bear's claws, the one that I want to show. So what you're seeing on your screen there, Shaun, is bear's claws on the left and lions on the right.
Right.
Now, lions have a sheath into which they can withdraw their claws. Bears do not. And they're shorter.
Oh. So they've got the claws out all the time?
All the time. Okay, so anyway, next to that, if we can pull it up, is an enlargement of the graven version at the Eagle's Gate. Right next to that image, Ben.
And thank you to everyone in the chat who's putting in their comments saying they're blown away by this. Tim sure has done his homework.
Okay, well, I'll go on and describe some other things on that heraldic achievement that we'll come back to once Ben finds that image. So you have the lion, leopard, bear, beast. You have the red dragon of Wales. You also have a unicorn, and the unicorn is unusual on his heraldic achievement as Prince of Wales because it has human eyes. It doesn't have the normal round, solid eye that you would see, for example, on a horse with no visible sclera or eye white. And the eye socket is also V-shaped on that unicorn. And there's a chain restraining that unicorn that is called a restrainer in heraldry. It's officially what it's called. And on that official version from 1969, it's restrained. Now there's another version I show in the book where it's loosed. And it's officially called loosed in heraldic terminology. But in both cases, the unicorn has human eyes. And it takes on a deathly appearance, you know, like not just a mean appearance, but a deathly appearance in the second version of the heraldic achievement that I show inside the book, where the chain is loosed. So that is speaking to the future, that second version of the heraldic achievement in the book. And it's speaking to the point where he's possessed by the devil in the future, by the red dragon. But Ben, are you able to find that image?
He sent me a message saying it's not in it's not in the folder.
Not in the folder. Okay. Can I share my screen to show it? Can I try?
Are you able to?
I should be able to.
Let's see.
I can certainly try, and we'll see how that goes.
Okay.
Let's see if I can if I can do it. Or maybe even just share a window potentially. So let me see if it lets me do it. Should let me choose the screen. Okay. You have to enable the audience to see what I'm sharing. Do you see the claws that I'm showing?
All right, let's see. Are they the grizzly claws?
Yep.
Oh, we've seen them.
They are the large grayscale one.
This one?
Not that. The screen that I'm sharing.
Screen. Let's have 1 second. It's
There you go. You have it. Yep.
That one?
Yep. That one. So that's an enlargement of the claws of that Dexter beast, or what looks like the left-hand beast to us, of the graven version that was over the Queen's Gate, or excuse me, the Eagle Gate. And let me just do an automatic adjustment here, make it a little bit easier perhaps to see. So you can see the length of those claws, and there's no sheath to withdraw them.
Yeah.
And there's actually 5 on this. One you can sort of see on the right-hand side. The other one is behind the compartment on which its foot is resting. But the point is, those are not lion's claws. So they kind of went out of their way to make that obvious in the graven versions at his July 1969 investiture versus the artistic version that is otherwise shown. And if I go back here for a moment to show that artistic version. Oh. Now I'll just show it on my screen for a moment. So you can see the claws here on this beast, right?
Yep.
There are actually 5. Normally in an heraldic line you'd see 3 or 4, but there are 5. The 5th one is hidden behind the foot in the compartment, behind this thing that the foot is resting on. But at any rate, this beast is like. So folks understand that Scripture doesn't say it's the lion's mouth, that it's, or the lion's head, or the leopard's body, or the feet of a bear. It doesn't say that. What it says is like. It says feet like the feet of a bear, body like the body of a leopard, mouth like the mouth of a lion. In other words, it reminds us of that when we see it. So we can see the proportions of the body here are slender, like you'd see on a leopard, right? The claws are exaggerated, like you'd see on a bear, and more obviously on the graven versions. And then the head is somewhat lion-like, right? It's not a normal lion or lion leopard representing England. And then you have the unicorn, which would normally represent Scotland over here. And it's got human eyes. You can see it's got a visible eye white, sclera, right there. Right?
Yep.
And in the other version inside the book, it's much more obvious that it's human eyes even. It's got the V-shaped eye socket. So, and then you have this chain that's called a restrainer, and it's bound in the lower right-hand corner, meaning it's connected to that compartment next to the red dragon, right? Mm-hmm. They call that bound, and it's a restrainer. The chain is in heraldry. That's loosed in the other version that I show in the book, and the hoof is lifted, and the dragon is touching this compartment in that other version, and the unicorn is rearing back. Now, there are 2 sons of perdition in Scripture. And in the New Testament, Judas Iscariot, a verse is quoted from the Old Testament of him saying that he raised his foot, or his hoof, is what the Hebrew text actually says, against the Lord. He's the son of perdition, Judas was, because he was possessed by the devil. The Antichrist is also called the son of perdition in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and he will, in the future, our future still, be possessed by Satan. At that point, this chain, this restrainer will be loosed, and the devil will be possessing Charles. Now, I'll point one other thing out here before I move on. You see this thing around the neck of the unicorn that looks like 3 horns that are plucked up by the roots?
Yep.
That's called the Label of the Eldest Son in heraldry. It's around the neck of the unicorn. It's around the neck of this lion, leopard, bear beast right here. It's around the neck of the second version of the lion, leopard, bear, beast up top above the crown, at the top of the heraldic achievement. It's most notably around the neck of the red dragon. It's telling us that Satan is going to become the eldest son, that the devil himself and Charles are going to become one and the same, is what the imagery is signifying. And then notice that it is also around the neck of the corporate heraldic achievement right here. Now in Scripture, a horn has three different shapes. One is like an elephant's tusk, or curved like you see on the helm here. This is the sovereign's helm in heraldry. Charles, even though he was only Prince of Wales at the time, was given the sovereign helm from the beginning, the same helm his mother had, even though she was monarch. That was very strange. He's always been viewed, in other words, as the sovereign from July 1969. But anyway, this is 7 horns, biblically, in a head, if you will. This is the corporate head of the overall heraldic achievement. In heraldry, this is a corporate beast. The whole thing corporately represents Charles because of this label of the eldest son that's in the center right here. So Charles is the little horn of the eyes of a man. He is the beast with feet like a bear, body like a leopard, mouth like a lion. He is ultimately to be the red dragon, or the red dragon. The devil is to be him. And the reason I pointed out these horns here is there are 2 other shapes for horns that fit the biblical text, both the Hebrew and the Greek. One is conical, like you see here on the unicorn right here, right? That's nobody disputes that's a horn. Another is shaped like a chemistry vial or flask, like you see for these 3. As if they were plucked up by the roots on this label of the eldest son. So what Scripture describes for the little horn and the 10 kings, the Antichrist, when his global government is constituted, is he is described in Daniel chapter 7, and we'll perhaps look at that chapter later. But in Daniel 7, he is called a little horn with the eyes of a man, who comes up among 10 horns, 3 of which are plucked up by the roots. That is the imagery you're looking at right here. These are the 10 horns in the center for the corporate heraldic achievement. 3 are plucked up by the roots. The little horn of the eyes of a man, the unicorn with human eyes, comes in among them. Now, in the context of the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, that was understood to be a unicorn. That imagery of the little horn, a unicorn with human eyes. And that's what you're looking at right here. Now, interestingly, that unicorn looks pale gray, right? And that's because the color combination that you're looking at here, the gamut, is CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and key, or black, that's used for book covers ordinarily. But when you look at this heraldic achievement in RGB, red, green, blue, the same achievement after it's been scanned in RGB and it's not on the cover of a book, the unicorn has a slightly different appearance. So this one I'm showing in RGB rather than CMYK. You can't see it on the color of the book, on the cover of the book, but notice the green hue right here.
Yep.
It's the color of rotting human flesh. Now, why is that significant? It's pale green gray, in other words. Why is that significant? If we look in Revelation chapter 6, verses 7 to 8, and I'll just pull it up for a moment here so that folks can see it. And I'll go to Revelation chapter 6. This is speaking of the 4th horseman of the apocalypse. When you look at the color of the horse as described in your typical English translation, it might say something like pale, a pale horse, like I'm highlighting right here. A pale horse, right? Some translations will say pale gray or something like that. But the Greek text from which this is translated is chloros, and it means pale green gray. And the literal meaning is the color of rotting human flesh. And the name of the rider of this horse, the 4th horseman, is Death. Now that's a title that's actually given to the devil himself in the New Testament. The last enemy that will be swallowed up is death. And that's the devil. So in other words, it's the devil himself who is the rider of this horse. He's the 4th horseman. But I just showed, based on that imagery, on Charles' heraldic achievement as Prince of Wales. And by the way, folks, he's still forever the 21st Prince of Wales. Just because he's King Charles III doesn't mean he isn't still the Prince of Wales. He is. He's still the 21st Prince of Wales forever. That heraldic achievement for him as Prince of Wales still pertains. Nothing has changed about that. He just gained additional heraldic achievements and devices as king. That's the only thing that happened. So the point is, Charles himself, when he's possessed by the devil, per the imagery on that heraldic achievement as first beast, will be death. That's who he will be. And that unicorn, that little horn in the eyes of a man, in Daniel chapter 7 is said to rule for 3.5 years preceding Christ's return at Armageddon. In Revelation chapter 13, that first beast, which is where we get that imagery of the beast with feet like a bear, body like a leopard, mouth like a lion, in this chapter, that first beast is said to be the one that rules for 3.5 years preceding Christ's return. In other words, they're the same individual. Two different sets of imagery split across the Old and New Testament for the same person. Now, have you ever heard, Shaun, and I don't know if your audience has heard this, what Charles' code word is with our Secret Service when he visits the United States?
No.
Unicorn. That's what they call him. That's his official code name.
Wow.
So, and when he was flying choppers and other aircraft for the RAF, he wore a red dragon patch on his jumpsuit. What was his code word or code name there? Red Dragon. That's what they called him. So he has the imagery. In other words, he's got the beast, the feet like a bear, body like a leopard, mouth like a lion. He has the little horn in the eyes of a man imagery. What does that mean? That means we can uniquely for Charles, of all people in the history of the world, ever, like ever, even today, we can do the name calculation legitimately for the very first time. Why do I say legitimately for the first time? Because in Revelation 13:18, there is a context that is required, and everybody's been ignoring this and overlooking it. There's a required context to do the calculation. And without that context, the calculation has actually no meaning in terms of identifying the top dog Antichrist of history, if you will. And that's who we're talking about. There are lots of Antichrists in the world. So the title of this interview today mentions Pope Leo also, right? Is he the Antichrist? Is it Charles? Who is it? This kind of thing. Well, undoubtedly, the popes of Rome have been Antichrists, no question about it. But biblically, there are lots of Antichrists in history and multiple Antichrists in the last days, preceding Jesus' return. But there's one individual to rule them all, one top dog Antichrist, if you will, and that's who we're talking about right now. And he's identified with this name calculation and this imagery. And the imagery is, and it says, here is wisdom, let him who has understanding. So somebody will do this. So that's the first point I guess I'll make, Shaun, is that Scripture is telling us that before this person shows up on the scene and has his global government for 3.5 years, somebody's going to identify him and do this calculation. It's right here in the Bible. The fact that this verse is here, it's telling us we'll know ahead of time who he is. The church will know. And those who are paying attention will know. So it says, let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. So that's a new piece of information. This beast, this strange chimeric beast that I couldn't understand, and I was asking God, who and what is this talking about, is a human being. He's a man. So somehow this symbolism represents him, but he's a man. And then it tells us his number is 666. So if that beast, and in context there are two beasts in this chapter, we're speaking in this verse about the first beast. The second beast of this chapter is actually the false prophet, the beast from the earth. The first beast is the one from the sea. The beast with feet like a bear, body like a leopard, mouth like a lion, and so forth. This beast arises off the coast in a manner of speaking of Israel. From the perspective of where Israel resides geographically on earth, the United Kingdom is off in the sea somewhere. And when the United Kingdom sends forces, for example, toward the Promised Land, toward Israel, they're going to rise out of the sea. And any forces following, in this case, Charles is the Antichrist when the time comes, will rise out of the sea from Israel's perspective. So that being said, that first beast, we do the name calculation. Now, what people have overlooked, even if they recognize that we're talking about a man and that this imagery needs to be here before we can legitimately do the calculation, right? Even if they get that far, what you can't get from the English here is the identification of the system. In other words, the system on which we're supposed to actually do the calculation is given to us in the Greek text. We're not actually free to go invent a system or contrive a system or try to figure out what the system is. And that is the major mistake that people have made when they've tried to look at this. So let's take a look at the actual system. So that is in my name calculation folder here. And I'll just pull it up for a moment, and then we'll talk about what the Greek text has. So here it is. It's a sequential system. What you're looking at here is an original Hebrew system that's given in the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament, most numbers that you would read about in an English translation weren't spelled out. Like we would write 6, S-I-X in English, right? Or 7, S-E-V-E-N. But in Hebrew, instead, it would be given as a single character for 7, a single character for 6. A single character for 90, a single character for 100, in the Hebrew. And the difference between these, it's the same character, but one is at the end of a word, one is within a word or at the beginning of a word, but it's the same character in the Hebrew language. Just two ways of writing the hieroglyph, as it were. Okay, so it cut off at 400 because there are only 22 characters, or hieroglyphs, if you will, in the Hebrew language, and it's sequential, right? So what happened historically, in the New Testament era and right before it, is this Hebrew system was transferred to Greek. And it was transferred sequentially, not phonetically. And that's how we know it's a sequential system, is by historical precedent. And so here is the Greek version of the system on the right-hand column. So these are the Greek characters. And in Greek, we expand it to include 500 through 900 because they did that, actually historically. And it's the Greek version of the system, which also is sequential, that's used to specify 666 in our Bibles. In the book of Revelation, the original Greek text, 666 is actually given with these 3 Greek letters right here. So and this is an interesting point, Shaun, most of the words in the New Testament that are given in Greek, unlike the Hebrew text, are written out in the form of words like we would write 6 or 7 in English, S-I-X, S-E-V-E-N, E-I-G-H-T for 8, this kind of thing. That's actually how most of the numbers in the New Testament are specified in the underlying Greek text. There are a very small number of exceptions, however, and 2 of them are found in the book of Revelation. One of them is for the 144,000 Israelites who are to be sealed. The number 144 in the Greek text is written using this Greek system with Greek letters. And then the other number is 666. So what you have here is one letter for 600, looks like X. A second letter for 60 looks a bit like, S really, or like an M turned on its side. And a third letter looks a bit like an S, 46. That's the Greek version of 666. That's what you find in the received text, or the Textus Receptus of the New Testament book of Revelation. It identifies the system for the calculation. Been there all along. And the translators understood this is 600, 60, and 6. And so in the Authorized King James Version, they'd say, 600, 66, right? That kind of thing. In English, 666. Well, it turns out when we do the calculation, if we just follow the historic precedent and we translate it sequentially to English, the original Hebrew system, but we cut it off for the last 4 characters so that W has 0 for its value. So we're violating the historical precedent slightly, only because we're not trying to represent the number 600 with that numbering system. We don't need to, because the only point of that was to identify the system in Greek for the Greek readers. The title Charles, Prince of Wales, by which he's been known globally until recently, is exactly 666. And again, that's still his title as the 21st Prince of Wales. But on the original Hebrew system, it's Nasik Charles of Wales. That's how it's given in modern Israeli Hebrew. And I go into detail in the book. Exactly 666 on the original biblical numbering system. So 2 different languages, sequential system, original biblical numbering system identified in the Greek text. Same title, Prince Charles of Wales, or as we're going to see, Prince Charles of Satan, of the Red Dragon. Exactly 666. Mathematically, if this is the only thing that we had to go on, this alone is statistically impossible. You'd be hard-pressed over billions of years to find any actual name with no tampering using this system that works out to 666. And the universe is actually only thousands of years old. I'm a young Earth creationist, and I believe that. But mathematically, this alone is statistically in the realm of not possible, but you're looking at it. It's a fact. And it happens to be in the context of that imagery of that first beast that we were looking at, that I showed on the heraldic achievement here. So if this is literally the only thing we knew about Charles, it would be enough, scripturally speaking, to prove he's the Antichrist. If it's all we had. But we have vastly more than this. So let's talk about some of the other things that we have. So I'll just mention briefly, I won't show any imagery for this, the lineage. I go into detail on his lineage in the book. People are looking in Judaism, unbelieving Israelites, which I'm not. I'm a believer, right? I'm a Christian. But they're looking for the Messiah to come, and they're looking for him to come from King David's lineage. And I will actually show an image here from Charles at his coronation for a moment, just to put this in a startling context. So what a lot of people don't know is that when Charles was crowned king of, the British Commonwealth, those nations that, accept the British monarchy as their monarchy, or king of England or king of the UK, right, in 2023, he also was crowned king of Israel. Most people don't know that. The British monarchy officially claims to sit upon the throne of King David. And the official lineage chart of Queen Elizabeth II, which was actually published long time ago in London, is available through Prophecy House, my publisher, with the book. People can actually get it. And on that chart, which is the official chart for Queen Elizabeth II's lineage, it claims that they descend from King David, that they are the royal house of King David, that they are of King David's line. That's a claim the British monarchy has now made for about a century and a half, officially, roughly. So Charles makes this ascent. Now, what a lot of people also don't know is that the rabbinic community in Israel is aware of the claim. Ronald Reagan was aware of the claim. He referred to Diana as Princess David, knowing that Charles claimed to be a descendant of King David. Israel on national television more than once has announced that Charles specifically is a descendant of King David, based on that lineage and these claims. Now, Israel today doesn't have its genealogical records in most cases, unless you have a last name like Cohen or Levi or this kind of thing. You can't prove what tribe you're from. It's just a family tradition and a lineage that goes back however far you can trace it, right? And the traditions in your family, you say, yeah, I'm of this tribe or that tribe, or I'm an Israelite, I'm a Jew, I'm a whatever. That's the basis of your evidence that you can bring to bear for most people unless you're a Cohen or a Levite. And the Kohanim, there's actually a genetic test that can be done by blood to know in that case today. But usually you don't know. And so here comes the British monarchy with a documented lineage that goes back thousands of years, literally. And they're saying to Israel, here it is. We descend from King David and from the tribe of Judah. And so the rabbinic community in Israel is looking at that and saying, gee, could that be true? Right? And it's an official claim. So Charles was crowned king of Israel. People don't know that. Now, do I believe that that's a legitimate lineage? Actually, I don't. But what is true, and this is also documented in my book, is he's a descendant from the tribe of Dan, meaning he actually is an Israelite. And there was a tradition in ancient Judaism and also in the early church that the Antichrist would descend from the tribe of Dan, based on a prophecy in Genesis when Jacob was speaking to his sons, who became the progenitors of the tribes of Israel, prior to his death, when he was blessing them and speaking to them at the very end. He spoke of the tribe of Dan, and he spoke to Dan, and he said, Dan will be a red dragon, by the way, a serpent, by the way, who strikes the horse's heels so that its rider goes backward. And then Jacob exclaimed, I have waited for your salvation, Lord, or Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, Yahuwah in the Hebrew. And the word for salvation there in the Hebrew is actually Yeshua. It's Jesus' name in Hebrew. I've waited for your Jesus. I've waited for your Yeshua. And the word that's translated as serpent in that prophecy in Genesis, in most English Bibles, is actually fiery red dragon. It's the same Hebrew word that's used in Genesis for the serpent that deceived Eve in the Garden of Eden. And how do we know that fiery red dragon is a legitimate translation? Because in Revelation chapter 12 in the New Testament, that's what's used. It speaks of Satan as the fiery red dragon and also as the serpent who deceived Eve in the Garden of Eden. So, all this is to say, Charles didn't bother to portray himself in a Christian sense for his crowning. He put the pagan green man, which is a chimeric lion human head, corpse's head, at the center bottom of his coronation invitation, surrounded by a crown of thorns. And the paganism around this has to do with death and resurrection of the green man. He's portraying himself as the crucified green man that gives life, foliage coming from this corpse's head. Now, Scripture tells us the devil goes about as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. So here we have a lion human chimeric head representing the pagan green man, and crown of thorns right here, and death and resurrection, right? How strikingly different from his mother's coronation invitation, and I'll show that one, from 1953. And by the way, she was not a Christian, and I'm going to come back to that, but her coronation put traditional emblems of sovereignty, if you will, some of which were ostensibly Christian, at the center in place of where Charles put the green man head. This is her coronation invitation, including the orb, which we're going to see is very significant, but that has the cross over it. It represents Christ over the world, or the British monarchy under Christ over the world, right? Because they put the cross at the top of their crowns. Or Charles usurping that. And I'll come back to the other aspects of his lineage. So he claims descent from King David. Well, a lot of people don't realize that the basis, the actual basis for the claims of the royalty, the nobility of Europe to have the divine right to rule, so to speak. You know, in Asian countries, Asian mythology, they'll say they have the divine right to rule. Their kings will, on the basis of allegedly being descended from the red dragon, you know, or the serpent, whom they view as a god. A lot of people don't realize that. That's their basis for the claim. The British monarchy and other royalty of Europe have made the claim that they descend from Jesus through this Merovingian lineage, alleging that Jesus, rather than dying on the cross, survived it, had children subsequently with Mary and or Martha, her sister, and that those children were stealthily placed on the thrones of Europe down through the centuries, through intermarriage, and became the lineage of the nobility and the royalty of the European royal houses. Now, that's a fraudulent claim, totally anti-Christian, fake Christian claim, right? Biblically. But this is the real claim that they're making behind the scenes for this so-called divine right to rule. Now, why is that significant with Charles? He actually believes it. He believes he descends from Jesus also. But there are two versions for how Mary and or Martha were impregnated. One was that Jesus did it, in this Merovingian mythology. The other is they were raped by a sea serpent, a red dragon. So, merging with the Asian mythology, in other words, for the divine right to rule, so to speak. And when we come back to Charles here, we come back to this thing too. A lot of people, when they were watching his coronation, they called this an eagle flask that had the anointing oil. And the oil, by the way, that filled this for his 2023 coronation was produced on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, from olives grown on the Mount of Olives, in Jerusalem, by various factions over there, including Anglican, Protestant, Greek Orthodox, etc. And then they filled this flask with it, and they think people were told this is an eagle, but it isn't an eagle. Do you recognize what that is, Shaun?
I don't. I used to do a lot of bird watching when I was a young person as well. Doesn't look as
Phoenix. It's a
phoenix. Okay.
And it's standing atop fiery flames. That's what's being portrayed today. The phoenix rising from the ashes. So in other words, you have again the intimation of death and resurrection with the phoenix, going back to ancient Egyptian mythology. And it was from this that Charles was anointed behind the screen. And I'll mention just a couple other things in relation to his coronation here. Well, I'll mention three other things, and there were a lot of things that I cover in my book on it. But this is the screen that was in front of him when he was being anointed. And nobody was allowed to see it. It was the first time in history where people weren't allowed to see the oil being poured on the monarch's head. First time. And it was also the first time where the audio of what was being said was hidden from the audience. They sang hymns and this kind of thing while he was being anointed, so nobody could hear what was being said behind the screen, right? When that oil was being poured on his head. Now, right after this, when he came out, the Archbishop of Canterbury called the world to pledge allegiance to Charles. Another thing never done before in history. So my question is, did the devil possess Charles at the time he was being anointed? Was the call actually to pledge fealty to the devil in Charles at the time that occurred? The fact is, we don't know. But I'm speculating here, and I have speculated, and I think that that's probably what occurred. Now, another interesting thing about this tree, ancient Babylonia was portrayed in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament as this giant tree, that gave shade to the other kingdoms, if you will, of the world that Babylonia ruled at that time, under the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. Well, the leaves of this tree, if people want to go look up high-resolution versions, have the names of the Commonwealth nations. This is the tree of the Commonwealth. And under it is a banner that basically says, all will be well, all manner of things will be well, kind of thing, under this tree. And at the top of it, it's actually portraying Lucifer, the day star, if you will, the devil, as a star at the very top above the tree. But anyway, they're proclaiming Charles' coronation, and at the base of the tree, and that tree represented Nebuchadnezzar in the Old Testament, the king of Babylon, At the base of this tree is Charles Rex, his heraldic badge is King Charles Rex, King Charles III. This imagery, and again, I'm not showing a high resolution version here, folks, but you can pull it up. But that's what that represents. So it's showing that the tree derives from Charles, that he's the one who upholds it. He's at the base. Okay, so moving on from that, there was a cross that allegedly had splinters from the actual cross of Christ at the coronation, produced for Charles, the splinters given by the Roman Catholic Church. All the people who officiated, the priests at Charles' coronation, wore Roman Catholic garb, robes, donated by the Roman Catholic Church. Most people don't know that. They weren't wearing Anglican Protestant garbs. They were wearing Roman Catholic garbs, because Charles has been trying to reunify Anglican Protestantism and Roman Catholicism stealthily for decades, working behind the scenes with Pontiff on that. And then the final thing I'll show here on the coronation is this. I don't know if you've got audio, but I'll just show the video here for a moment. I'll pause it for a sec. Notice this figure here that I'm circling with my mouse?
Yep.
That may have been a verger in a robe with a staff that looked like the angel of death, you know, with his sickle going past. But this was the day of the coronation. And nothing happens by accident when you're there in Westminster Abbey already. And you've got a verger in full view of the global audience, a verger presumably, but nobody's really sure, you know, passing that entrance looking like the angel of death carrying a sickle. And in fact, a lot of people around the world, when they saw this, they said, "What is that? Is that the angel of death? The Grim Reaper? You know, at Charles' coronation, what's going on?" Right? People literally said that. They literally thought, because they didn't understand that that could be a verger, right? In a robe looking like the angel of death. But that was the imagery that was invoked, which was shocking to a lot of people. So, moving on from there, let's go back to his July 1969 investiture just briefly. What I want to point out to folks is that the red dragon was central to the whole thing. So right here on this gray Welsh slate platform that looks a bit like a flying saucer from above are three thrones, only one of which has a backrest, and that's the central one that the Queen is sitting upon. The other two don't have backrests. On her throne, the one with the backrest, the red dragon is engraved in gray Welsh slate. Behind her are these red dragon banners. To the left and right of her and Charles and Prince Philip are more huge red dragon banners. Behind Charles and in front of the Queen, as she's seated here, are more huge red dragon banners. This is the interior of the open-air Caernarvon Castle. On the exterior of the castle, at the gates and the entrances, were more red dragon banners that were hung and or emblems of Charles' heraldic achievement as Prince of Wales, graven versions. Now, what's significant here is that later, when Charles knelt to face the Queen, as she put the coronet on his head to coronate him Prince of Wales, he was facing that dragon, and so was she. It literally encircled them, and he was facing the dragon on the backrest of her throne from which she stood up, literally facing it through her when she put the crown on his head. So why do I point all that out? Because it's literally true of Charles, that the dragon gives him his power, throne, and great authority. It is not, and I'm going to come back to this, not as monarch that he gains his global authority. It's as the 21st Prince of Wales, as the Prince of Darkness, as Satan's prince. Now, people may look at this and say, well, okay, so he's the 21st Prince of Wales, William's the 22nd. There were 20 other princes of Wales prior to Charles, right? Only a few of those in history were invested, like Charles. William is not going to be invested. Charles is the only one with whom the Red Dragon was ever associated at an investiture, I believe, to my knowledge. The only one. And he's the only one for centuries to have the Red Dragon actually as part of his heraldic achievement, in addition to that, regardless of name. So it's literally true of him that the dragon gives him, as that first beast, the beast with feet like a bear, body like a leopard, mouth like a lion, etc., his power, his throne, and great authority. Now here's the queen presenting him later. You can see the dragon is on either side of him, left and right. That same dragon. And then here's the badge of the Black Prince with the 3 ostrich feathers. Now we looked at Hebrew for 666, the numbering system, a bit ago, showing that Charles, Prince of Wales, is 666 in English and Hebrew on that system. Well, these ostrich feathers have the shape of the Hebrew letter Vav. And in Hebrew, the letter Vav, the number assigned to it is 6. So this is another version of 666, with the dragon on either side and Charles above, being presented to the world as ruler of the world with the orb at the top of his head, right here. As Prince of Wales, wearing a crown designed to look like the crown of thorns. It's actually created with nails, gold nails, all around this crown, based on Edward's crown originally. Very simple crown. So, Ich dien, what does that mean? It means I serve. Ich dien, ich dien, I serve in German. So on Charles' heraldic achievement as Prince of Wales, this imagery that we looked at a bit ago, you read it top to bottom, left to right, our left as we're looking at it, even though it's really the right-hand side from the perspective of the heraldist. It reads, I, the Black Prince, this is the badge of the Black Prince, or I-666, with those 3 ostrich feathers. And this is the ring. This is the image that Charles has worn on his signet ring for decades, including at his coronation. I, the Black Prince, or I, the Black Prince, this is the shield of the Black Prince, with 15 gold bezants representing Crusader coins when the Crusaders captured Jerusalem from the Muslims. So it's I, the Black Prince, or I, the Black Prince, serve the Red Dragon, serve Satan. That's how you read this. Now, there was a Crusader title taken first by Godfrey de Bouillon, one of those of the Merovingian lineage, which was King of Jerusalem, because they captured Jerusalem from the Muslims. That Crusader title has been passed down historically to whomever was the most prominent monarch or of the royal line of that Merovingian dynasty or lineage historically. As it turns out, Charles has the strongest of those lineages, as I document in the book. So he could, based on that lineage, take the Crusader title, King of Jerusalem, for himself as well, if he wished to do it one day. So I'll just say one more thing about this. This is the Harp of Ireland. This is the Red Lion of Scotland. A lot of people mistake this for the Red Dragon. It's a lion. The Red Lion of Scotland on the royal shield. Mm-hmm. And then what normally are 6 lions or 6 lion leopards for England on the royal shield. And then you have 4 more that is on the shield of Wales here in the center. So there are 10 lions normally. Well, you would say normally 6, but for Charles, they're actually all lion, leopard, bears. And I show an enlarged version of these in the book, in the Antichrist and Cup of Tea. 7 of them have their heads unobscured on this. 3 have their heads obscured. So again, it's this idea of 10 with 3 plucked up by the roots in a manner of speaking. But this is representing the coronations of the United Kingdom, and Charles being over them, and thus also the Commonwealth, right? In the Old Testament, these lions are called the lions of Tarshish. Now, theologians have looked at Tarshish in the Old Testament, and they think, well, that might be Spain or Gibraltar, the Strait of Gibraltar, but actually that's incorrect. Even back then in the Old Testament days, England was what now is England, that those isles were trading even with the Promised Land, that territory that was Israel's even that long ago. And seafaring Danites from the tribe of Dan made their way to what historically became the United Kingdom in Jeremiah's day. And that actually is how the British monarchy ultimately descends from the Danites. So I've documented that as well in the AntiChrist and a Cup of Tea book. Now, another thing is Charles claims descent from Muhammad. So we've got David and Jesus so far, right? Both probably fake lineages, actually descended from the tribe of Dan, however. He claims descent from Muhammad through what's known as the Hashemite lineage. So Jordan's King Hussein makes that claim because he's an Hashemite. Saddam Hussein made that claim as an Hashemite before he was killed. Charles descends directly from Muhammad. He's of that same lineage. Why is that significant? Because with other things that I document in the book, he is a shoo-in to be the Mahdi of Islam. And he is the most popular Westerner, bar none, to the Muslims of the Middle East and the world, period. And has been since basically almost July 1969. From that lineage and for other reasons. So one thing your audience may not know, Shaun, is that Charles has an honorary doctorate in Islamic studies. He converted to Islam in the 1990s under one of the most prominent Sunni Muslims in the world, the guardian of Islam, also documented in the book. So he's got an honorary doctorate in Islam. So far as Muslims are concerned, he is a Muslim. And he claims descent from Muhammad. So all that is documented and a whole lot more around that in the book. And apart from that, he's an Assyrian, a Babylonian, a Roman by lineage, historically. You know, obviously an Israelite, a Greek, a French, a German, a Russian, almost an Egyptian, you know, descending from ancient pharaohs. Any lineage of note historically since Noah's flood, you know, in the history of the world that could be called royal or prominent, significant for some religious reason, Charles has that descent. Obviously, his sons do as well. But his sons don't have this imagery, and they don't have the name calculation, and they never will. That means neither William nor Harry can be the Antichrist. I've seen people out there saying, well, William, and they invent some system to try to show 666, not using the biblical system for William. And then they'll look at William's heraldic achievement and they'll point to this thing and they'll say, see, he's got the red dragon too. And they don't understand that actually, no, that's the red lion of Scotland. It's not the dragon of Wales at all. So, in 1953, Elizabeth II declared that, or pardon me, in 1953, Wales, let me get my history right, made the red dragon their national symbol. Even though they'd used it for many centuries, you know, prominently, they made it the official national symbol of Wales in 1953. In 1958, Elizabeth II created Charles, Prince of Wales, and declared to Wales and to the world that in the future she would present her son for an official investiture to the people of Wales when he was older, when he was a young man, which she did in July 1969. Between those things and before them, Elizabeth II was involved in Gorsed Druidry, which is satanic druidry in Wales. The Red Dragon of Wales is their official symbol at the center of Gorsed Druidry. It's not harmless, and it's not just a bunch of bards or hypocrites, actors, you know, like they will claim to the public. They are literally Satanists, the Gorsed Druids. And so Rowan Williams, who was a Gorsed Druid, you know, an Archbishop of Canterbury, was one of them, right? Well, the royal family, and I'm including not just Elizabeth II or Prince Philip, but their parents, in this case Elizabeth II's parents, Charles' grandparents, and then their grandparents before them and their parents before them, all involved in Gorsed Druidry in Wales, in forest ceremonies. And you can see both photographs and video footage of Elizabeth when she was still princess, participating in Gorsed Druidry in the forest with the red dragon at the center. And you can see the same thing for Charles' grandparents. I bring that up, and by the way, also, of course, later for Prince Philip. I bring all that up because also in 1953, right after she became queen, Elizabeth II had her own event at Caernarvon Castle. And central at that event was the Red Dragon, just like in July 1969. It was on the cover of the Order of Service, the thing that she and the audience members held in their hands. Yeah, and world leadership was present for that event, not just people of the Commonwealth. It was before her when she appeared at the Queen's Gate in 1953 herself, as a brand new queen. It was right below her in a huge symbol where we saw the red dragon on either side and the badge of the Black Prince beneath Charles and the Queen, and under his graven heraldic achievement as this imagery that's on our screen here, the graven version. When we saw that in 1969, in her case in 1953, instead, it was just one huge version of the Red Dragon of Wales. What am I saying? I'm saying she was a Satanist. And you know this, and your audience, if they've been paying attention to you for a while, know that Satanists and non-Christians have infiltrated not just Roman Catholicism, but the church at large. Many denominations around the world, but especially Anglican Protestantism and things that have come from it, and Roman Catholicism. And I don't hold that Roman Catholicism was ever Christian. From my perspective, it was never a Christian church. It was always the world's largest fake Christian cult, anti-Christian cult. That was true forever. Now, Anglican Protestantism has been Christian at times, and the schism came out of Roman Catholicism originally, and that's how Henry VIII got the title Defender of the Faith originally. It was conferred by the Pope when he was still a Roman Catholic, and they were talking about Roman Catholicism. Well, the British monarchy decided, we like that title, we'll keep that. When they formed Anglican Protestantism under Henry VIII, who was not obviously faithful. He had a number of wives executed and did a lot of other bad things. But we got the authorized King James Version translation, which was a very good translation for the time, from the Hebrew and Greek, under Anglican Protestantism, under him and those who came after. But at any rate, Charles came along in our time and said, I don't like that title, Defender of the Faith. I want to defend everybody who's of quote-unquote faith. Faith in anything, in other words, not the faith. As long as you're not claiming there's only one God and one way to salvation and one truth, spiritually speaking, that leads to heaven rather than hell. As long as you're not claiming that, I'm good with that. That's Charles' tack. I want to be defender of faith. So in fact, he changed it for his coronation to that, to defender of faith. Among other things, one of the other things he did is he had other religious quote-unquote traditions participating in the coronation and actually handing some of the items for the coronation to him and to others for the coronation. So, for example, he had Sikh and Hindu and Buddhist and unbelieving Israelite, Jew, Muslim, Hindu participation, all of that was part of his coronation as king. Never done before in history in any coronation of a British monarch. Not even when they were Roman Catholic, never. So he went full pagan, in other words, in his coronation. Full everything except the truth. And then, through the Archbishop of Canterbury, the devil called the world to pledge allegiance to Charles. Fealty to Charles, if they were willing. Okay. What's happened since his coronation? Oh, sorry, let me go back to the British monarchy is the German monarchy. They are the French monarchy. They are not just the Greek or English monarchy. And in fact, they changed their name from a German name after World War I to the House of Windsor. Because World Wars I and II were both fomented in Germany. And we're now looking at the same thing with World War III, potentially with Ukraine. And do you know what is sitting in Germany that's unique? In the book of Revelation, the Lord says he knows where Satan's throne is. Are you familiar with the verse? It's talking about Pergamum, which was in Turkey. Geographically and historical context, when that verse in Revelation was penned, written by the Apostle John under inspiration, there was a throne in Pergamum that is now located in a Berlin museum in Germany. And it's been there since right before World War I. It is the throne of the devil, according to Revelation. The Pergamum throne, one of his thrones, apart from the one in London where Charles sits, you could say. So you could say that's very interesting then, that the three world wars, certainly the first two and perhaps the third, were fomented out of Germany. Now NATO is going to break up, and I cover that in my book from 2018 called North Korea, Iran, and the Coming World War. I'll just show this briefly. So I started writing this one back in 2007, where I identify the rider of the second horse of the apocalypse. I pointed out Charles is the fourth horseman, right? The top dog Antichrist over history, who'll be possessed by the devil, if you will, and who'll come in as that little horn in the eyes of a man over a global government in the future, preceding Armageddon. Well, the rider of the fiery red horse, the second seal, the second horseman of the apocalypse, who also is an Antichrist, is identified in this book. But also that second seal has to do with World War III, among other things. And it ties in with North Korea, Russia, China, Iran, and I think most interestingly, with Magnolia Oil Corporation and then Mobil Oil and now ExxonMobil, which has a stake in Russian oil. A lot of people don't know that. And in India, processing oil from Russia. Currently, all that oil that's being brought into India from Russia to process, a lot of it is going through ExxonMobil for refinement and to then go elsewhere in the world. A lot of people don't know that. So, and then Rex Tillerson, who was the former CEO of ExxonMobil, was the Secretary of State when this book was published under Trump. So this is from 2018, but I talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what comes next in here. We've seen the pause at this point in Ukraine. But the rest of what's coming, including how World War III will develop, and China going after Taiwan, North Korea going after South Korea and Guam and Japan and so forth, the attack on the U.S. ostensibly that will occur with all of that, etc., all of that in this book. Now, the important point in this to understand is that World War III comes before the global government. It comes before the Great Tribulation. Those seals are in sequence. It's roughly a seal per year in Revelation chapter 6. It's the fourth year, the midpoint of it, where the global government is constituted under Charles. Now, he's in his 70s, right? A lot of people look at him and they say, well, he's not young. The Antichrist has to be young. But that is not a biblical criterion at all. And when we're talking about a counterfeit Christ, why can't he just as well be old? The opposite of the real Christ. Old and ugly and stale. Rather than young and virile and tough. Christ was a carpenter's son, probably, a pretty tough, physically looking person before he was crucified. But you're talking about the opposite of that right now, ostensibly with Charles, though he was very athletic when younger. Went through training that would be almost equivalent to Special Forces training. Commanded a minesweeper, has flown aircraft as well, helicopters and military planes. Been a polo player, which is a somewhat dangerous sport. Daredevil skier, a lot of things you can point to about him that are not anything than what a lot of folks would call a man's man, so to speak, right? But now he's old. Does that mean he can't be the Antichrist? No, it doesn't. Does it mean he's going to kick the bucket because he got cancer? No, it doesn't. And in fact, they've said he's recovering well from that. Lots of people live with cancer. And I'll just say, I'm a survivor of cancer. More than a decade ago for me. Stage 4 cancer. There are people who survive cancer. Charles is going to survive. He won't die until he's killed at Armageddon. But what about his age? Well, both of his parents, who are now deceased, Elizabeth II and Philip, they were both nearly 2 decades older than he now is when they died. And his mother remained on the throne to the end. So purely biologically speaking, there's no reason he can't live long enough for these things to be fulfilled. There are other things we can look at scripturally. We can look at biblical chronology. But let me come to another thing before I go into that. I said that there's lots of other evidence concerning Charles, and despite everything that I'm sharing here, folks, I am in fact actually only scratching the surface of what's in the book in many cases. So what you're looking here is the actual idol, a miniature version of it that's to go on the Temple Mount in the future. This was created in the early 2000s to Charles, years after the first edition of the Antichrist and the Captivity was published. That was published in 1998. I started it in 1987. And lo and behold, years later comes the abomination that causes desolation. But it's not on the Temple Mount yet. And there's no holy place to stick it in on the Temple Mount yet in Jerusalem. How do I know this is that statue? Well, I'm going to come back to that. But some of the features of this idol are that it has Charles' face, explicitly has Charles' face. It represents him hovering over a mass of humans looking up to him as savior of the world, quote unquote. The base of this statue is inscribed with the words savior of the world, British spelling, S-A-V-I-O-U-R, of the world. The artist and the Brazilian government that commissioned this, it was the Brazilian government of Tocantins, were hailing Charles as the environmental savior of the world, hence the green marble at the base. And one of these individuals underneath is holding a bottle of wine, red wine, officially, according to the description of the statue. So he's either crushing the heads of those beneath him, or he's hovering over them, depending on the article you read. And it's Charles with angelic wings, dressed only in a loincloth, nothing else, and hovering over these bodies as the ecological savior of the world, quote unquote. Now, this was right after the Rio Earth Summit, which is documented even in the first edition of the Antichrist and Captivity. I think it was, yeah, because it was right before that book was published. But at the Rio Earth Summit, that was the first major global eco-fascist, I'll say, climate agenda agreement ever in history. Charles personally was credited by global leadership, including Al Gore, for the success of that summit. He specifically was singled out. And that's the reason this statue was commissioned by a Brazilian state government later. Why was he singled out? Because he called for and he held meetings aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia before it was decommissioned. And he chaired those meetings to hash out the issues that would be addressed at the Rio Earth Summit beforehand. So Al Gore, the president of Brazil, other global leaders said the reason the summit itself was a success was because of Charles. Now that summit led to the Kyoto Protocol, which the United States didn't sign on to, which in turn led to the COP agreements, the Conference of the Party Climate Agenda Agreements of the United Nations, subsequently. The most significant of those was the one in Paris, in I believe it was 2015, Paris, France, until the most recent one. And at that gathering in Paris, you had the largest gathering of international leaders in the entire history of the world at one place anywhere ever, still to this day. 150 plus heads of nations and 190 plus global leaders overall. You had Barack Obama there, for example. Now this was in France. You would think that the leader of France would have opened the event and given the first speech, perhaps, since he hosted it, right? Or if not him, maybe Barack Obama, because he's the leader of the most powerful nation on earth at that time, ostensibly. Why not him? Or maybe Al Gore, because people think of the climate agenda or the climate scam, however you want to view it, and they think Al Gore must be him. Why not him? He was there. But actually, it turns out it was Charles who opened the event and Charles who gave the first speech. Why? And at the center of the group photo later, who is at the center in the position of prominence under the Paris signage? Charles, not anybody else. He was at the center of all those world leaders of the photo, very center. So there's a reason for all that. And this statue, by the way, Genesis 3:15. The very first prophecy in Scripture about a coming Messiah was given to Eve in the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve fell. And this is the prophecy where God himself is speaking to the devil, the red dragon. And he says, I'll put enmity or conflict, warfare, between you and the woman and between your seed. So the devil has his own seed, individually and collectively. And her seed, that seed is Messiah, right? But God has his seed individually and collectively. We individually as Christians are God's seed, but collectively we are in Christ, in Messiah. He's the seed. And her seed. He, the woman's seed, in this case Messiah, will crush your head, bruise your head. Now the Hebrew word that's translated as bruise here means pierce, crush, stab. It means all of those things, and bruise. And you shall bruise his heel, pierce, crush, stab. And the word translated heel is more literally translated protuberant. Anything that sticks out from the body, in other words. Well, gee, my head sticks out from my body. So do both of my feet and both of my hands. In other words, Christ was pierced in his hands and his feet. He's going to come back and pierce the devil's head. In this case, the Antichrist head, who is possessed by the devil. Typologically. And crush the heads of those who are in the devil rather than in the woman's seed, in Christ. So in the Antichrist, the spirit of Antichrist, rather than in the spirit of Christ, the spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, right? Okay, well, what we're looking at with the statue is a perversion and inversion of Genesis 3:15. Here comes Charles as the Messiah to crush the heads. Gee, that's not right. Okay, well, it gets really more interesting here in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. And I am probably the first person ever to notice this in the Hebrew text, and I wrote about it in the second edition, the 2024 edition of the Antichrist Cup of Tea, where I go into the Hebrew text, the root words. But this is the verse that Christians look at, and they say, well, there's going to be a 7-year period before Armageddon and before Christ's return, a 7-year tribulation period or tribulation week, that has the Great Tribulation, the latter half of it, and as its last 3.5 years. They look at this verse to suggest, based on the context of the verse, which is Daniel 9:24 to 26, that there's a period of 490 years, or 70 periods of 7, and this is the final 70, the 70th period of 7, therefore it's a period of 7 years. That's how they look at it. Others have looked at this and said, no, it's about Christ's crucifixion, because it sounds eerily similar, with him being crucified at the midpoint of the week, if they accept that he was crucified on a Wednesday, rather than a Thursday or a Friday, the fourth day of the week, in other words, for the crucifixion. And that he was resurrected at the end of the weekly Sabbath, the end of the seventh day, rather than on Sunday. In other words, between the days, at the exact end of the seventh day, at the exact beginning of the first day at evening, biblically. Only God could cut the days that finely, so to speak, in terms of timing. But setting that aside, and I have a whole series devoted to that called Messiah History and the Tribulation Period that's coming, where I show that all the weeks of Scripture are patterned after the crucifixion week, and that Christ, in fact, was crucified on the fourth day of the week and resurrected at the end of the weekly Sabbath. That's actually what's true. Setting that aside, when we look at this verse in context and understand we're actually most literally looking at a period of 7 years, not 7 days. So not the crucifixion week, but a week that may be patterned after the crucifixion week. but nonetheless a week of 7 years. In this verse, it says and the context is this prince of Roman lineage, and it's a prince who sits on a throne, or a ruler of Roman lineage. In this case, it's the Antichrist in context. That little horn of the eyes of a man from earlier, Daniel 7. Then he shall confirm, and the Hebrew word there is gabor. It means make strong or strengthen or impose or enforce. So in other words, it's not necessarily something that Israel will agree to. A lot of people think the Antichrist is going to sign a treaty with Israel. That's how we'll recognize him. That is not true biblically, and that is not what Scripture is actually talking about. Instead, he's going to come along, and under him, this treaty, this covenant, is going to be imposed or enforced upon the parties. In other words, whether they like it or not, this is how it is when the time comes. Most of the world will agree to it because it's a covenant, it's a treaty. But he's going to make it gabor. In other words, he's going to strengthen it, he's going to make it strong, he's going to impose it or enforce it. Did you know, Shaun, that the meaning of the English word Charles, the name, is strong man or make strong?
No.
Yep. That's the meaning of Charles' name. So make strong or strengthen a covenant or a treaty. With many, in the Hebrew it's la rabim, and rabim is the Hebrew word for many, but it has the same root word as Rabinovich, Yitzhak Rabin, who signed the Oslo Accords, Oslo I and Oslo II, and was killed right after Oslo II. Whole other discussion, and I won't get into it today, but I will say that I document in the book and in a coming multi-volume series called Israel, quote-unquote, Peace, and the Looming Great Tribulation. And folks, please understand, I have dozens of books still coming, most of which have been worked on for more than a decade each. So they're all going to come out in short succession. It's going to be like an explosion of books from me all at once. But in the Antichrist and Cup of Tea book, and in that coming multi-volume series, I point out that the entire false Mideast peace process has been under Charles from the beginning, going back to the London Agreement of 1987 between Jordan's King Hussein and Charles. So that's documented in my book. And so the Oslo process, the roadmap and the quartet, and that's the stage we're at now, still the roadmap and the quartet, apart from the Saudi Peace Initiative, which ties to the Abraham Accords. All of that has sat under Charles and people who directly report to Charles to this day. I mention all that simply to put context to this verse and the covenant that's going to be imposed under Charles as the Antichrist. And again, all of this is documented in my book. I come with receipts, and you've seen today, I don't just say stuff without evidence. I come with biblical receipts. Every single thing I'm saying is documented with the footnotes and the original sources in every book I put out. I never say anything without giving the source, and I make it verifiable. So coming back to this, the Hebrew text here, where we read in our English here, and on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate. Now, in the Gospels, in the Olivet Discourses, Christ talked about the desolating abomination based on this verse, that stands where it shouldn't stand. When it's in place, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains and the wilderness. That's basically what he says in the Olivet Discourses in the Gospels, referring to this thing here. But the translation here in English is actually very poor. And what the Hebrew text is actually talking about is not just a wing or extremity of a future temple or holy place. It's talking about an idol with outstretched wings in the Hebrew text that's actually dressed only in a loincloth. That also is in the Hebrew root words of the text of this verse. And you can't see it in the English translation, just like you can't see the numbering system for calculating 666 in Revelation 13:18 in an English Bible, even though the Greek text specifies the system to use. So the Hebrew text is actually describing a statue with outstretched wings dressed only in a loincloth. Now that's significant not only because the name Charles is intimated in the same verse, and there is now a statue, there has been since the early 2000s, to Charles, showing him with outstretched wings dressed only in a loincloth. But it's significant because that statue historically is modeled after statues of Jupiter for the Romans and Zeus for the Greeks. And a version of this was placed, in this case of Zeus, in the holy place in the temple that Antiochus IV, so-called Epiphanes the Great, who desecrated the temple in the 2nd century BC under the time of the Maccabees, from which we got Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication in the New Testament and the Old Testament, in between the Testaments, I should say, and then in the New Testament. We got that feast when the temple was cleansed after Antiochus IV had desecrated the temple and sacrificed a pig on the altar, and he set up an idol, according to some accounts, of Zeus there in the holy place. Exactly what's being described in Daniel 9:27. Only in the case of Daniel 9:27, it's later in history. It's not yet fulfilled. So Antiochus, in other words, was typologically a type of the Antichrist, of Charles as the Antichrist. And if one goes and looks at those idols to Zeus and Jupiter from the Greeks and the Romans, they'll typically find that it was a man either completely naked or dressed in a loincloth with a bird of prey, like a vulture or an eagle, next to him. And often he'd be putting his hand on the head of that bird of prey. But once in a while, that idol was portrayed with the wings itself of that bird of prey. So we have here Charles actually portrayed as Zeus or Jupiter. In other words, this is the idol that's going to go on the Temple Mount. Now, the artist who created this is dead. Mauricio Bentes, and I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, Portuguese. A Brazilian artist who died not long after this was created, and he handed this to Charles. This version, the one you're looking at, the miniature, is about 1.5 feet high, roughly. Photographed by the BBC. That's a BBC photo in the early 2000s, and the BBC reported on it. And I actually have a 2005 prophecy conference where I shared the audio of that BBC report along with this statue. But the same artist commissioned a larger version of this statue that would be, depending on the account that you read, between 12 and roughly 16 feet high. Exact same thing. Why is that significant? Because depending on which measurement you accept, and there were conflicting news reports, that could be exactly 10 cubits by the biblical measurement of a cubit, also depending upon which measurement of a cubit you accept. It could be precisely 10 cubits in height. Also, I point this out in my book. Now, why is that significant? Because in the second temple, the Temple of Solomon, there were 2 angelic statues placed on either side of the Ark of the Covenant, the lid of which had 2 cherubim, 2 angels, 2 cherub. Cherubim is the plural version of cherub. A lot of people say cherubs in English. There were 2 cherubs portrayed on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, covering their faces with their wings, but facing toward the center of the ark where the mercy seat was. But on either side of the ark in Solomon's temple, in the Holy of Holies, the holy place, were 2 10-cubit high angelic statues representing cherubim. Well, in Ezekiel 40 to 44 in the Old Testament, in the future temple, not the millennial temple, so not the one that is going to be desecrated in the Great Tribulation, but after that, in the millennial temple, when Christ is reigning for 1,000 years on earth after Armageddon, after he's healed the world from all the devastation and so forth, and after all surviving mankind has become Christian, that temple will not have an ark. There'll be no Ark of the Covenant in that temple in the Holy of Holies. Christ himself is the living word, and a tablet was placed representing God's 10 commandments, part of the word, inside the ark, right? But we're going to have the living word in the millennial temple. But what's significant is in the tribulation temple, the holy place that's going to be desecrated, this idol is going to be placed, and it's going to be 10 cubits in height, most likely, if it's the full-size version of this. So I think it'll be this exact idol. Could it be a variant instead? Could it be a hologram of this? Or of our dear leader, Charles? Not my leader, but, the non-Christian world's leader, giving some spiel in the Holy of Holies, a live hologram. Well, he's already done a live hologram on stage, as has Al Gore in Saudi Arabia. Charles has in the past. He's already done that kind of thing. Could it be this or his first beast heraldic achievement shown in the Holy of Holies, or some combination thereof? I do think so, and I think that's what Scripture's talking about. So Charles has, to sum up just some of the core evidence that we've talked about, he has this idol, right? The desolating abomination already exists for him, and it's described in the root words of Daniel 9:27. He has the first beast imagery of Revelation 13, uniquely. No one else has ever had it. No one else ever will. And I should point out in regard to this, that this is not just created because someone wants to make it look a certain way. There are international laws that pertain to heraldry globally. And knights historically that would joust, for example, when they jousted, they'd be identified by the heraldic symbols on their armor because their faces were covered when they were jousting. That was one of the bases for heraldry in England historically and in the UK and the world. But ultimately, there were international laws that were developed. And there are heralds who are professionals. And this achievement was created under the Garter Herald King, who's the most powerful herald in the world, who is over the College of Heraldry in London, following the international laws of heraldry. And what they do as part of that is they take some of the symbols from each parent's heraldic achievements, if each of them has their own. They combine that, and then they add unique symbols for the individual to whom the new heraldic achievement that's unique is being granted. So for Charles, there are unique elements here that will never be on anyone else's heraldic achievement, and the overall combination can never be given to anybody else, not descriptively nor symbolically in terms of the imagery. So William and Harry can never have this, ever, nor can anyone else, past or present or future. And the Garter Herald King officiated, was part of the officiation at Charles' investiture in July 1969, and in fact, led Charles to the dice, the round disc that looks like a UFO from above, on which he was crowned. And coming back to this just briefly, there were a couple of things captured on film that I've noted in my book that I don't think anyone else ever noticed. But one involves the Garter Herald King, which is why I'm going to show it here now. This person leading Charles right here is the Garter Herald King. And Charles is about to come out of this entrance right here. This is the Chamberlain Tower, the exit to the interior of Caernarvon Castle from the Chamberlain Tower. And Charles is about to poke his face out right here at the next instant, literally less than a second later. But notice what appears right here outside the entrance to the Chamberlain Tower. It looks like fiery paws vertically up the edge of the entrance, just caught on this frame. And this is the same frame reel of the next thing I'm going to show. In other words, the same camera and the same set of film captured this as the next thing I'm going to show. But Charles was being led. He was about to exit this chamber, and all of a sudden this, what I call fiery pause, suddenly flashes to the camera. And this camera, which is not digital, captures it. You know, analog film. And then after this, when the Queen is placing this crown on Charles' head that has the world, the globe at the top, you get this thing that I call X lightning. It flashes 5 frames of the camera capture this. And if it was 1 frame or whatever, you might look at this and say, why would somebody scratch the film like that? Right? Why would anybody damage the film like that? and just this one spot out of the entire reel of film. Well, 5 back-to-back frames captured this. What was happening at this moment? Well, here's Prince Philip sitting on his throne with no backrest. Here's the Grey Welsh slate throne from which the Queen stood up with her backrest, and the dragon is engraved in Grey Welsh slate on this throne. Behind it on the castle walls are those huge red dragon banners we saw against white sheets, the red dragon with tassels. Mm-hmm. On the opposite castle wall, in front of this throne and in front of the Queen's face, are more huge red dragon banners that she's facing. So behind her and in front of her. Same thing with Charles. He's facing the dragon on the throne, but then he's also facing those red dragon banners behind the throne. And then behind him are more huge red dragon banners. And then to the left and right of both of them are still more huge red dragon banners. So it's circled by the red dragon. So at the moment that she's putting the crown on his head, this X-like thing, which is shaped in the same form as the 600, right? And this of the 666 from the number 666 of that Greek character, the very first letter, this X-like thing appears in 5 frames. And it's going from the backrest where the dragon is engraved, through the chest and the arm, really, and the chest of the Queen, and through Charles' head, while she's putting the crown on his head, and then through Prince Philip's head. And then through the microphone array to the right that Charles is going to speak from subsequently. After he's been coronated, invested as Prince of the Red Dragon, Satan's prince. So was this the devil possessing Charles, transferring to Charles at the time that the crown was put on his head? I'm asking the question, right? And why is this on 5 frames of this reel of film? So that's documented, including the reel of film and where people can find it, the exact frames in the book. So I view those 2 things as potential supernatural events that were attesting, if you will, to the nature of Charles when he became Prince of Wales. Now, all of that was a long spiel about what happens with Charles and global governance, what happened after July 1969, right? So he called for global governance through the United Nations. We saw the press release, right? Let me come back to what happened after Charles' coronation. Ruler of hell. So this is one thing that happened. And I'll start with the photo as it was unveiled, the way it looked to the press, right? He has a monarch butterfly over his shoulder, which is associated in the occult with death and resurrection. So, Phoenix Flask, death and resurrection, ancient Egyptian lore. Crown of thorns, the pagan version, green man's head, death and resurrection, associating himself with Christ, AntiChrist. Monarch butterfly, death and resurrection, but also chimeric hybrid. The monarch butterfly has, in recent years, decades, become associated in comics and in science fiction and so forth with chimeric hybrids like kaiju, like the Monarch TV series, for example. Right? But again, death and resurrection. Looks like it's painted in blood. And then the color of Charles, this is more CMYK here, but the color, if you see it in person, it's actually pale green gray, like rotting human flesh. People immediately looked at this and they said, is he a living corpse? Is that what is being portrayed here? Why is it in red? Was this actually painted with blood? Is he the ruler of hell? And what's up with that butterfly? Right? That was the initial impression. Well, there's so much more to this than meets the eye initially. So, Charles himself personally unveiled it. His first official portrait, he personally approved this and knew about it ahead of time. It wasn't a surprise to him that he was being portrayed as death warmed over, maybe the ruler of hell, and associated with death and resurrection. people took this and they mirrored it and they flipped it, inverted it vertically. And what did they see in the center? The Baphomet, which is an androgynous, multi-thousands of years old, Gnostic portrayal of the devil. Why androgynous? One of the things that the Gnostics were for is male-female organs in the same being. They thought that Adam was really just Adam, and when he became Adam and Eve, that before that he was androgynous. The Gnostics, that was one of their teachings, part of their thinking. But that was, satanic nonsense. Nevertheless, you get male and female organs in this goat-horned satanic version of the devil that's a multi-thousands of years old symbol associated with Gnosticism and so forth. And look where it shows up. Right here in the center of this portrait of Charles. Here are the horns. The thing with the flames above the center right here. Here's the head. So I'm circling it right here with the mouse. Do you see it?
Yeah.
Mirrored and flipped. But Charles, as if he's descending to hell. For that to be obvious, right? On his way down. There are many, many other occult symbols that are hidden in this mirrored image that others have pointed out, things I didn't even notice myself till they pointed it out. But so overtly satanic. And how obvious was this to people? Well, people made videos about this. So there's not just the official video of Charles actually unveiling the portrait, but I'll open one here in the browser. Whoop. And then I'll show it. So you can see how one person interpreted it. They made a spoof on what was there, right? So here's someone's spoof of Charles unveiling this thing. I don't know if you can see it play. Why it's freezing on me here. Might have to refresh my browser so you can catch it. Here we go. Hopefully it'll show up if it agrees to play. Well, it's unfortunate that it's freezing. Oh, maybe see if disabling this will help. Well, I'll just freeze it right there. That's my main point. They're trying to portray Charles as the devil, right? They're understanding that this is representing Charles as the devil. Somebody else's spoof on it. So that made global news. The world looked at that and they said, what is this telling us about our monarch, about Charles, right? And the fact that he's approving of it, no less. Is he admitting to being the devil? Is that what he's indicating about himself? Those were real questions that people, non-Christians and Christians alike, were asking. But most of them still not understanding that he's the Antichrist, not getting it yet. So let's take a look at some other things that transpired. Alleged authority over earth. So here are some more things. A couple of them documented, three of the ones that I'll show here, actually documented in the second edition of the Antichrist and a Cup of Tea. So this one is documented in the book. This is an official Royal Mint gold coin showing Charles as next to or riding the Dragon of Wales and receiving the orb that represents the earth from the devil. You know, in Scripture, the devil tempted Christ. And one of the temptations was, if you'll just bow down to me, this was after his wandering in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights without eating. If you'll just bow down to me, I'll give you the kingdoms of the world and all their glory, right? And Christ didn't say to him, no, you don't have authority to do that. It belongs to me. He said, yeah, depart from me, ultimately to him, right? He refused the temptation. Because when Adam, to whom the world was originally given by God, submitted to the devil, along with Eve by sinning. The devil gained authority over earth. Well, now we have Charles, who is the prince of the red dragon, the actual biblical prince of darkness, the black prince, if you will, Satan's prince, saying, sure, I'll take that world, thank you very much, to the devil. That's what this is actually portraying. And that's an official Royal Mint coin. This is the same year. This is the Chinese version of that same red dragon. Charles is also on the other side of this coin. Just like you see Charles on the side of this one here. Charles is also on the other side of this one, another Royal Mint coin. The devil as the serpent, the red dragon of Genesis 3. And here's Charles on the other side of that coin. And this one is most startling, I think. Not that the others aren't, but here you have Charles himself as the all-seeing eye of George Orwell. But it isn't actually Orwell's all-seeing eye. He got it from the capstone, the all-seeing eye capstone, the pyramidal motif of the ancient occult mythos, including ancient Egypt, right? The all-seeing eye capstone, that's the actual origin of this. Well, here's something, Shaun, that I don't think anybody else has ever noticed, and I've never mentioned it in an interview before, so I'm going to mention it to your audience here for the first time ever. In the week of history, that all-seeing eye, meaning the 7 millennia, the 7 days of the week of history since the fall of Adam and Eve, to the end of that week, which is the great white throne judgment and the new heavens and new earth after Christ's 1,000-year reign. So we're nearing the end of the year 6,000 now. We're nearing the end of the 6th day of that week now. The 7th day is Christ's 1,000-year reign. In the week of history, how is the little horn of the eyes of a man portrayed in an overarching manner? He is that capstone with the all-seeing eye, the horn with the all-seeing eye. That is the historic version of the little horn of the eyes of a man, if you will. So this is another portrayal of that, and it's associated with Orwell in 1984 and Newspeak, where things mean the opposite of what is, literally stated, where words are redefined to mean their opposites in many cases, right? So, and there it is again. So it's telling us Charles himself is to be that all-seeing eye, that little horn of the eyes of man, and to be Big Brother. Right? I mean, it's in your face. And this also, by the way, is a Royal Mint coin. And here's another one. Charles, this is another version. This is the 2025 version of the Year of the Snake, or the Serpent for Charles. Again, him on the other side of the coin. So they keep doing this. So who is he worshiping, really? And, again, which version of the Merovingian lineage is he embracing? The one that alleges descent from Jesus, or a serpent that raped Mary or Martha? A red dragon. And so, now there were, there are actually a couple other things that are very significant here. These are documented in that 2024 edition of the Antichrist and Cup of Tea. The first one was Terra Carta. This is an initiative of Charles, part of his green movement, if you will, and incorporated in the World Economic Forum, which, by the way, he heads. He also heads the United Nations already, and I'm going to come back to that. Terra Carta is his initiative, and he is proclaiming authority over the earth through Terra Carta, environmentally, in this case. But then came, not to be outdone, then came Astra Carta, where he's proclaiming authority over the whole solar system and then the universe itself. Now, what does the devil want to do? The devil wants to set his throne above the stars of God. According to the Old Testament, the king of Tyre, who was a type in this case of the devil, in Ezekiel and Isaiah, in this case Ezekiel, I think it's chapter 28, we have to go look it up. The passage I have in mind is either in Isaiah or Ezekiel, but It talks about the devil wanting to set his own throne above the stars of God. And so what do we have? The devil asserting authority over the stars of God, and whose initiative is it? Charles. Okay, so moving on. Do you ever wonder, Shaun, why it would be Charles handing Hong Kong to China?
Mm-mm.
Why would that be? Who is really running China? Do you ever wonder how China got its communist government?
I haven't read the story of how that happened, but is that not the truth?
Well, it did come out of the CIA, partially. Yeah. But who is over the CIA? Well, it's been meshed with British intelligence the entire time it's existed, under the crown.
The Anglo-American establishment.
Uh-huh. Right. And who is running drugs through China? The Anglo-American establishment, particularly the Anglo part of it, early on. The drug trade, the opium trade.
Going back to the Opium Wars, yeah.
Exactly. Right. And so naturally, who would hand over Hong Kong? Well, you might think the British Prime Minister, it's going to be associated with Britain, because isn't he over the UK? Wouldn't he be the one over this city called Hong Kong? Well, apparently not. Apparently it was Charles, just like it was Charles who, opened the COP Accord or the COP talks in Paris in 2015. Gave the first speech. And by the way, he's opened more and given speeches at more since then. It didn't only happen there. Again, front and center for Charles, but it was Charles who did that. So let's talk about the origin of the United Nations. It goes back to the League of Nations, right? It came out of the League of Nations. What was the origin of the League of Nations? What would you say about the origin of the League of Nations?
The World Wars.
Yeah, World War I, right? Germany fomented World War I. So the League of Nations, the world got together and said, well, we can't have more world wars. That wasn't really too much fun. Let's do something about it. Let's create the League of Nations. Well, that's what the public would think. But actually, the League of Nations mostly started out of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, also known as Chatham House in London. Who heads the Royal Institute of International Affairs today?
Charles.
That's right. Who has headed it since 1969?
Was it the Queen before Charles?
Well, now see, that's our temptation to say it was the Queen, right? No, it was Charles. Just like he got the sovereign helm on his heraldic achievement from the beginning, even though the Queen was the sovereign. He got the same helm she did. So the United Nations came out of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which came out of the League of Nations, which came out of the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. Let me ask you, and of course the UN came out of World War II, also fomented in Germany ostensibly, right? And if a certain royal had had his way, the United Kingdom would have lined up with Hitler in World War II rather than the United States, right?
Yes.
Even Prince Philip, Charles' father, was educated in Nazi Germany before he came out of that education system, right? But his educator and the approach to education out of Gordonstoun came out of Nazi Germany. Charles was educated by the same educator in the same system, called the Platonic ideal. That's what they call it. At any rate, going back to Plato, that philosophy, and anyway, that was closely tied to, as it turns out, Hitler and the Nazis as well. So, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House. Do you know the history of Chatham House?
No.
Why it exists? Chatham House was originally created for only one purpose. It had one overriding purpose. That was to create a global government under the British monarchy. I kid you not. That's the reason for being for Chatham House. So what did we get out of Chatham House? The League of Nations, World War I. The United Nations, World War II. After World War III, which is coming, then we get global governance via the expanded Security Council, ostensibly of the United Nations at that time. All tracing back to something that sat under Charles since 1969. So how about authority over the United Nations itself? The UN has a global security lecture series that's had it for decades. This is my favorite example. There are others. So, for example, every public-private partnership thing you could think of, if you trace the history of it in the United Nations, all of it traces to Charles and his public-private partnership initiatives as Prince of Wales, in every case. When we talk about the Global Security Lecture Series, it was Charles himself who called for that. He wanted it at the United Nations. So what happened when he requested that? He wrote the first Global Security Lecture, and he personally delivered it at the United Nations himself. He wrote it, he gave it, and there's been a lecture every year since, a Global Security Lecture. Okay, I mentioned the peace process, which is under the Quartet. That's the final stage of it, apart from the Saudi peace initiative, right? People don't know what the Quartet is if they just hear that phrase. It's just a fancy way of saying a collaboration between the United Nations, the United States, the European Union, and Russia, or formerly the Soviet Union, now Russia. Russia used to be the Soviet Union on the Security Council. Now it's Russia. Russia took over for the USSR when it fell, prior to the Quartet. But anyway, the Quartet is a combination of Russia, the United States, the European Union, and then because the United Nations is the fourth member, well, guess what? It's actually the whole world, isn't it? Unless you disagree with it. The head of the Quartet for several years originally was Tony Blair, after he was Prime Minister of the UK under Charles. Of course, he reported to Charles the whole time. The heads of the Quartet since have also been under Charles in every case. Prior to the Quartet, we had the Oslo process. The Quartet supplanted the Oslo process. The Oslo process supplanted the London Agreement of 1987. All of this is documented in detail in my books. The London Agreement happened as a result of Charles asking a Lord Victor Mishcon, who was his lawyer, as well as a lawyer for Diana, by the way, to arrange meetings between Jordan's King Hussein and, at the time, Israel's Shimon Peres. Shimon Peres was a knight of Charles. He became a knight of Charles. The London Agreement was basically calling for something like what became the Madrid peace talks subsequently in Madrid, Spain. But it was shelved prior to that by Yitzhak Shamir, who was prime minister over Shimon Peres, pardon me. When Yitzhak Rabin became prime minister, Peres revived things under Yitzhak Rabin. So anyway, a roundabout way of saying it all traces ultimately to the London Agreement of 1987, but also to a knight of Charles, Shimon Peres, who called for the new Middle East. And when you look at the language, and the idea of building this so-called peace around economic agreements and so forth, as is core to the Abrahamic Accords and also core to everything related to the Oslo process and the Quartet. The Quartet was initially built around, the roadmap of the Quartet was built around security, negotiations in the Oslo process, and then peace negotiations. The latter part never happened because Oslo III didn't happen, got supplanted by the Quartet, by the roadmap. That's where we are today, and then this sideshow called the Saudi Peace Initiative and the roadmap, and the Abraham Accords. Anyway, back to Charles and the United Nations and so forth. The World Economic Forum. Klaus Schwab is one of Charles' knights. A lot of people don't know that. Bill Gates and the World Health Organization, his activities around that and the COVID jabs. Bill Gates, one of Charles' knights. When you get into the elitists of the elitists, they're all either under Charles or one of his knights. They're all tied to him at the top. But the global government itself could happen in one day. We could wake up one day and the Security Council could be expanded to 10 permanent members, with Germany and Japan being added, or 3 of the 10 are from the European Union, all under Charles as monarch. The next day, Charles could be declared their monarch of Germany and Europe, or Germany and France, for example, or of the European Union. Right after his investiture in July 1969, one of the things that Charles publicly called for, and you probably haven't heard this, is being king of the European EEC of Europe. He said, I want to be king of Europe, quote unquote. This is documented, including the source, in my book. He officially called for himself as king of Europe. He didn't want to be king of just the Commonwealth or the UK. And then when he visited the United States and he met with people who were fans of the British Commonwealth, and talked to him about that and said how lovely it would be for the United States to join the British Commonwealth, he said, I'm not really interested, and I'm paraphrasing him very much here, not really interested in a British Commonwealth. I'd rather have a global Commonwealth where the whole world, is under me. Well, simultaneous to all of that, he called for a standing United Nations army. A lot of people don't know this either. In conjunction with the security lecture series and so on, with himself as the commander of that voluntary force. Also documented in one of his biographies. So you can go on and on and on with this stuff, but he always somehow shows up at the center of global events, and the elitists are always pursuing his agendas. And when we talk about UN 2.0, a big part of that is under the World Economic Forum. Klaus Schwab being the founder of the WEF, and the entire time almost being one of Charles' knights, and founding it right after Charles became Prince of Wales in July 1969, officially invested as such. And now people think, well, Klaus Schwab is gone, right? He's retired as CEO, if you will, of the WEF. But no, actually, he hasn't gone away. He's just in the background. There's just a new CEO, so to speak. But these folks still report to Charles. So I described how global governance was to be created through the RIIA originally under the British monarchy, and now we're close to that, and it'll come after World War III. For 3.5 years preceding Armageddon. So World War III is, years before Armageddon, years before the Great Tribulation even. It's in our not too distant future now, World War III is. But anyway, prior to all of that, there was the eco-fascist environmental movement under the British monarchy. It actually began with the British Flora and Fauna Protection Society of the 1800s, tied to the British monarchy. So you got the British Fauna and Flora Protection Society, then you got later things, such as the World Wildlife Fund, and then funds, plural, the World Resources Institute, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN. You had Prince Philip heading some of those things from the beginning, including the UK's WWF, World Wildlife Fund, now under Charles. So, and later under Charles. So people could start their research with the Pirbright Society, Pirbright, and Prince Philip, and what came out of World War II and the Nazis, if they wish, to begin to look at where we went from there. At any rate, so this press release from December last year, totally real, and totally in line with Charles' character and the things that he's actually pursuing. So I'll share one more thing, and then I want to open it up to any questions people would like to ask.
Tim, let me just interject. Yeah. You've got hundreds of questions. It's going to take hours.
Okay. You want to move on to questions?
No, I'm going to suggest we do a part 2 later in the month for the questions, because it's almost midnight here in the UK.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. It is, isn't it?
But, you've been very generous with your time. We're almost at 2.5 hours. Oh, wow. Let's do a conclusion, and then if you'd be so kind as to come back to do a part 2 in a week or two, that would be phenomenal. We can start to go over these questions, because it's going to take hours. I've never seen so many come in. You've got 3,000 watching live, and you've already had 30,000 people watch you this evening here. So it's something else, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me share my screen one more time here, and I'll do a wrap up, just a quick summary of what we've talked about, and then where people can get the book and find out more. More than we can even share, in future podcasts, because there is a whole lot in the book.
Of course.
Okay, is my screen showing?
There we go. Should be back. There you go.
All right, folks. This is for you who tuned in somewhere in the middle, and then you want to go back and watch this. So we talked about Revelation 13 and the imagery of the first beast, and then Daniel 7 and the imagery of the little horn of the eyes of man, and pointed out that both sets of imagery are uniquely on this heraldic achievement for King Charles III as the 21st Prince of Wales, which he remains. He still is. So he retains this heraldic achievement and that imagery. Then we talked about the name calculation done in the context of that imagery using the biblical numbering system, showing that the title Charles, Prince of Wales, without any tampering in both English and Hebrew, with normal spelling, no tampering, works out to exactly 666. And I pointed out that mathematically that alone is not possible, even if the universe are billions of years old, but really it's only thousands of years old. So the combination of what I just shared in less than a minute is all you need to prove that Charles is, no ifs, ands, or buts, the top dog Antichrist of all history and all scripture. Without controversy, without being able to gainsay it or contradict it. But that's just the beginning of the evidence. So another thing that we looked at is the statue to Charles that will serve as the desolating abomination. This already exists, and it matches what's described in Daniel 9:27 in the root words of the Hebrew text, as I mentioned, and as is addressed in the book, documented in the book. And the book is The Antichrist and a Cup of Tea. In this case, you want the 2024 second edition because it's massively updated and a lot more in it than the first edition. But anyway, the statue is described in detail in the Hebrew text, and it portrays Charles as Zeus and as Jupiter of pagan mythology. And this is the statue, I believe, that will go on the Temple Mount, the Desolating Abomination, in the future. Already exists to Charles with his face. We talked about global governance at length. If you tune in the middle, you probably caught some of that discussion here at the end, so I won't reiterate that. I'll say go back and watch the whole interview, including that most interesting press release that's real, I'm saying, from Christmas last year, where Charles called for global governance under himself through the World Economic Forum and the United Nations. And by the way, the Great Reset, let me point one last thing out that I didn't mention in the Great Reset. I said Klaus Schwab was one of Charles' knights. But do you know that it was Charles himself who announced the Great Reset from the World Economic Forum, not Klaus Schwab?
Wow.
And that Klaus Schwab wrote his book and published his book by that title that came out months after Charles made that announcement at the World Economic Forum calling for the Great Reset. So in other words, it's Charles' Great Reset. It's not Klaus Schwab's Great Reset. And when Charles called for, trillions of dollars at his disposal, quote unquote, people look at that and they say, well, is he talking about the Antichrist? It must be somebody else at his disposal, right? But I'm actually saying no, he's referring to the devil, at the devil's disposal. And when Charles is possessed, they'll be one and the same. And he's also speaking of himself in the third person. And so when you get to this, this came out literally right after the second edition went to press. And people were emailing me and saying, did you get this in the book? And I'm saying, no, sorry. It came out after the book. So, yeah, anyway, it's portraying Charles, people think, as death warmed over, like a living corpse, as the ruler of hell, with the intimation based on this monarch butterfly over his shoulder of death and resurrection. That's what they think. And I add to that chimeric hybridization, which is a whole other topic. And then people pointed out, of course, and I mentioned the Baphomet in the center of this when you mirror and invert this imagery of the devil, and quite a few other things showing up in the center of this imagery. And one thing that I think I neglected to mention, and I'll just point it out very rapidly here, is the Shroud of Turin is also hidden in the imagery. Another intimation of Charles portraying himself as if he were Christ. These are the crossed arms on the Shroud of Turin. This is the shroud right here. And here's Charles' portrait. When you portray the whole thing in green, right? And negative. Accidental? I don't think so. And yet, how could the artist have known all these things, right? And hidden the Baphomet when he was painting that, and it looks like it's in blood. And then finally, it's probably not finally, but we talked about some of the things that happened, like Astrocarta, Terra Carta, the symbolism portraying Charles as receiving the world from the dragon, and that being central to his investiture, as Prince of Wales in July 1969. And I will show one last thing, if I may, and then I'll tell people where they can get the book that we actually did not cover really in this interview. And I'll just show it very briefly. And that is the Birmingham Games, where Charles was leading the world in Molech bull idol worship. And the Battle of Los Angeles with an anti-gravity craft, a UFO, I call them UGOs, unidentified gravitic craft, that was recreated over this bull and also portrayed as the all-seeing eye of Lucifer at the same event. And Charles was overseeing this. And the bull here is actually facing a mock Tower of Babel with a coiled serpent representing the devil in it, and at another point with the red dragon on its side. So without going into that here, Charles oversaw this worship of the devil prior to receiving the crown. And actually, here's the coiled serpent in that mock Tower of Babel. Right there, this is the snake scales right here. And when you watch it live, it's writhing inside the tower here. The serpent is. And this is the all-seeing eye, the head of the serpent at the top. And then later they show and actually, I don't remember if it was later or right before this, they show the red dragon on the side here. The Dragon of Wales. So, all right, where can people get my book? So I know the site is primitive, folks, but it does work for getting the book, and eventually it'll be redone. And you can get my book and see other things that are out and coming at prophecyhouse.com, and that's where you can get the Antichrist and Company, the second edition. And it does ship to the United Kingdom. There is no electronic version of it, and it's yet to be decided if there will be one. So right now, if you want it, you do need to get it in print.
And the links are in the description box, and I've just put the links in the live chat as well for the website, and the specific link at the website for the book is in the live chat as well. So please support Tim's important work. There's tons more stuff in the book because, we've had to... YouTube is a minefield. We've had to navigate the community guidelines this evening, but the deep stuff is in the book. So please check that out. And like I said, if you're watching this on replay, you'll find the links in the description box if you're watching on YouTube. Well, huge thank you, man. My head's going to explode. I have to watch this again. There's so much. You've jigsawed things together so well.
Thank you. And one thing, if I may, pardon me for interrupting. Please, folks, if you're interested in more, sign up for my channel as well as Shaun's, because I'm sure there'll be more interviews. God willing.
Yeah, we will get your channel link. Oh, but baby Ziggy wants to come and say hi as well. He's just run in. Shouldn't you be in bed by now, Perfect. Baby Ziggy?
All right.
You're going to wave to Tim? You're going to wave to Tim?
Hi there, Ziggy.
Say hi. Say hi. He just turned 2.
That's great. That's awesome.
Well, Tim, I will let you go and I will close the show, and you have a great rest of your day, and we will be in touch about a part 2. Thank you, Tim.
I look forward to it. Thank you. Shalom. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, Mummy, can you grab Ziggy? I'm still, oh, he's laughing. Everybody watching, thank you for tuning in. Hopefully we'll get Tim back soon. Thank you for all of your questions. And like I said, Tim's links are down in the description box. Also, if you missed the podcast we did earlier today with the prison officer who was also a crematorium worker, Kevin, well, this video, when it ends, it will take you over to it. So thank you. I'm going to spend some time with Ziggy before we go to bed. Take care out there. Much love.